The tank sat silent in the middle of the motor pool, its massive frame hulking like a fallen giant. Engineers circled it for weeks, tracing wires, swapping parts, running diagnostics. Nothing worked. The Army's brightest minds were stumped. Manuals were tossed aside. Tools slammed to the floor. Frustration hung heavy in the summer heat. Then, an old man stepped through the gate. 80 years old. Wrinkled hands. A slow, uneven gait. He wore a faded cap with a single word, veteran. No one knew his name. No one invited him. But something in his eyes stopped the noise cold. At first, the soldiers chuckled. An old-timer thinking he could fix what a dozen engineers couldn't? It was almost funny, until the lieutenant spotted the combat engineer patch on his jacket, and a small, nearly forgotten medal pinned quietly beneath it. What happened next wasn't in any textbook. It was the kind of moment that lives in hushed barrack stories and late-night campfires. A military tribute to real war heroes. This wasn't just a man. This was one of the unsung heroes, the kind who never asked for thanks, but carried battlefield courage in his bones. And he was about to show them all how it's done. The problem began at Fort Brody, a testing site deep in the heart of the Midwest. The Army had deployed a newly retrofitted Abrams tank for evaluation, equipped with enhanced armor, a hybrid drive system, and advanced targeting. It was the pride of modern innovation. But barely a week into trials, the engine sputtered, then died completely. It wasn't just a simple malfunction. Diagnostics failed to pinpoint the issue. The tank's powertrain was locking up intermittently, sensors reported conflicting data, and the engine would engage for seconds, only to shut down unpredictably. Every time it was powered, a different error emerged. It was as if the machine itself refused to operate. Teams from across the country were called in. Combat engineers, mechanical specialists, even civilian contractors. Day and night, they labored. Manuals were cross-referenced. Prototype components were swapped. Yet the tank remained dead. The project commander, Lieutenant Kyle Rembrandt, a sharp West Point grad with commendations in engineering, was losing patience, and so were his superiors. Pressure mounted. The tank was costing $1.4 million in daily downtime, and the base morale had begun to drop. To the soldiers stationed there, this became more than just a machine. It was a ghost. A stubborn, metallic symbol of defeat. But not to Staff Sergeant Mark Ellis. Mark had been stationed at Fort Brody for 2 years. A reliable NCO, quiet but respected. He was the one who noticed the older man lingering near the fence one morning. He was sitting under a tree, sipping coffee from a battered thermos, watching the tank with the gaze of someone who understood more than he let on. That man was Walter "Walt" Dempsey. He wasn't loud. He wasn't imposing. But there was something about the way he watched. As if he was reading the tank's silence like a war memoir. It was Ellis who first approached him, offering a polite nod. "You served?" Ellis asked. Walt chuckled softly, pulling his jacket tighter against the wind. "A long time ago. Long enough that the tanks still had personalities." Ellis smiled, but something in the old man's voice lingered. Walt had heard about the tank issue from a local contractor. It gnawed at him, not because of pride, but because he had seen this before. Decades ago, under fire, with lives hanging in the balance. When Ellis returned to the engineering bay later that day, he couldn't shake the image of the old man under the tree. Something about the way he'd spoken, measured, quiet, but certain, made him feel like this was no ordinary veteran. That night, curiosity got the best of him. Ellis ran a background check through an old Army contacts database. Walter Dempsey, Master Sergeant, Combat Engineer, Korean and Vietnam Wars. Bronze Star, Distinguished Service Medal. Retired 1987. A name lost to time, until now. The next morning, Ellis made a request few lieutenants would dare. He brought Walt past the gate and into the motor pool. The guards raised their eyebrows. So did the engineers. Lieutenant Rembrandt was furious when he saw a civilian approaching the tank. "This isn't a museum," Rembrandt snapped. "We don't need grandpa stories. We need results." Walt didn't flinch. He looked the young officer in the eye. You've got 20 tools and no instinct. That tank's not broken. It's misunderstood. Rembrandt smirked, but Ellis stepped in. Sir, with respect, let him try. We've run every test. What's 5 more minutes? Grudgingly, the lieutenant stepped aside. Walt didn't ask for schematics. He didn't touch a laptop. He simply climbed up onto the tank like he'd done 100 times before. His hand traced along the side panel, pausing at a junction near the exhaust ports. This weld, he murmured, more to himself. She's breathing hot air back into her core, choking herself out. The engineers looked puzzled. Walt continued. New systems, old flaw. You've got an overheating loop disguised by digital noise. That's why the codes keep shifting. She's got a leak that's confusing the sensors. It was a diagnosis no one had even considered. Not because they weren't smart, but because they were looking through the lens of modern systems, not mechanical soul. Walt saw the tank not as a problem to be solved, but a story to be read. Still skeptical, Rembrandt ordered the team to follow the old man's lead. They opened the junction he pointed to and found the issue, a microfracture in the thermal shielding, rerouting exhaust toward the intake valve. It was buried so deep even thermal scanners missed it. The fix took under an hour. When the tank roared to life that evening, the entire bay froze. It didn't just start, it purred. The kind of smooth ignition that even the engineers hadn't heard since the first test. Walt didn't cheer. He didn't boast. He simply smiled, wiped his hands on a cloth from his pocket, and stepped back down. That's when the lieutenant noticed the ribbon on his chest. The Distinguished Service Medal, an honor awarded to only a select few for extraordinary acts of courage and ingenuity in the field. Where did you serve? Rembrandt asked, quieter now. Walt looked out across the field. Places you don't talk about at dinner. And just like that, the mood shifted. What once seemed like a forgotten old man was now a living embodiment of battlefield courage, the kind of quiet strength that built generations of soldiers. Walt wasn't just a mechanic. He was one of the forgotten heroes. The kind who saved lives not with speeches, but with skills. With sweat. With instincts no algorithm could replicate. The sun dipped low over Fort Brody, casting long shadows across the tank yard. The engine still hummed like a heartbeat, the crew watching it as if afraid it might vanish back into silence. But their eyes kept drifting to Walt, the man who had breathed life into steel. Later that evening, Ellis invited Walt to the mess hall. He sat across from him with a tray of food, joined by a few young engineers who, until hours ago, wouldn't have spared a glance. What was it like back then? One finally asked. Walt took a long sip of water, then leaned back, the distant noise of soldiers playing cards filling the background. We didn't have diagnostics. No tablets. No laptops. Just talk, grit, and timing. You either learned to listen to the machine, or men died. His voice was calm, but the weight in it silenced the table. There was a night in '69, he continued slowly. Da Nang. Our M48 Patton stalled mid-crossing in a jungle creek. Whole unit pinned down. Engine was flooded, hydraulics blown. We had 20 minutes before artillery zeroed in. No moon. No cover. I crawled under her in the dark. No tools, just instinct. Bypassed the starter with a piece of comm wire. He paused. We rolled out with 5 minutes to spare. No one spoke. It was more than a war story. It was a glimpse into a life built on split-second decisions and unspoken sacrifices. The kind of soldier sacrifice you don't read in textbooks. Ellis finally asked the question lingering on everyone's mind. Why didn't you ever teach? Write books? You could have trained thousands. Walt smiled sadly. I tried. But times changed. They stopped listening to men with grease on their hands. Got replaced by men with degrees on their walls. That's fine. I had my time. I just never thought I'd see a day when a tank spoke again. And someone still understood what it was trying to say. It was then that Lieutenant Rembrandt entered. He walked over, no longer the rigid officer from before, but a man humbled by something greater than rank. I owe you an apology, he said, offering his hand. And my respect. Walt took it, the gesture firm and brief. No pride, no superiority. Just mutual understanding. The next day, word spread quickly. Soldiers from across the base came to see the old guy who fixed the ghost tank. Some shook his hand. Others simply nodded with a reverence rarely seen outside of a battlefield graveyard. But the most unexpected moment came during morning formation. Colonel Jameson, commander of the base, stepped forward in full dress uniform. In his hand, a citation printed just hours earlier. We speak often of inspirational military leadership, of sacrifice, of valor. But today, we honor a man not for what he did today, but for the decades he carried this nation on his back without fanfare. Walt was called forward. And there, beneath the flag, surrounded by soldiers young enough to be his grandchildren, Walter Dempsey was awarded the Commander's Medal of Excellence, a rare post-retirement honor granted to those whose actions remind us what service truly means. He didn't cry. He didn't speechify. He simply nodded and said, "I didn't fix a tank. I remembered a promise." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with gratitude, the kind reserved for real war heroes. The following days felt different at Fort Brody. The engineers worked with renewed focus. Conversations shifted from manuals to mentorship. Soldiers began asking questions they never cared about before, questions that had nothing to do with specs and everything to do with soul. For the first time, they didn't just want to fix machines. They wanted to understand them, to respect them, because Walt had shown them that behind every bolt, every gear, every engine, was a legacy. Walt didn't stick around for long. He never wanted fanfare. One morning, he quietly packed his things, thanked Ellis, and started heading for the gate. But just before he left, he turned back and saw the engineers gathered around that same tank, tools in hand, not rushing, not guessing, listening. Ellis jogged up beside him. "Where are you going?" "Home," Walt smiled. "My job here's done." Ellis paused. "You taught more in one day than most of us have learned in years. You could still stay. Mentor the next group." Walt's eyes glinted with something between pride and sorrow. "I've had my wars. It's their turn now. But tell them this." He reached into his jacket and handed Ellis a folded, faded patch, his original combat engineer insignia, browned by time and smoke. "If you wear this," he said, "don't just wear it for me. Wear it for the ones who never came back to tell their stories." Ellis stood silent, knowing this wasn't just a keepsake. It was a torch being passed, from a generation that built history with their hands to one that now had to carry it forward with their hearts. Walt turned and walked toward the gate. But just before he reached it, the tank's main gun rotated slowly, on its own, and dipped downward in what looked like a nod. Walt stopped, smiled, and saluted. Behind him, dozens of soldiers stood quietly. Then one by one, began raising their hands in a solemn, unified salute. No orders. No commands. Just a moment of pure, unfiltered respect for a forgotten hero. That photo would eventually hang in the base's Hall of Honor. It would be titled, "The Last Salute, a Tribute to the Quiet Ones Who Remembered for All of Us." Walt Dempsey's story isn't written in textbooks. You won't find him in national headlines or Hollywood films. But every base, every barracks, every battlefield, carries men like him in spirit. The ones who didn't ask for applause. The ones who saved lives with calloused hands and unwavering hearts. The unsung heroes who remind us that service never retires. Walt showed the army that fixing a tank wasn't just about tools. It was about trust, memory, and duty. He may have walked out the gate, but he left something behind that would never break down. Honor the quiet veterans in your life, because their silence often hides the loudest acts of courage.